Keanu Reeves had always been fascinated by the unseen corners of society, the places and people often overlooked in the hustle of daily life. It was this curiosity, combined with a deep sense of empathy, that led him to embark on an unusual social experimentum that would shake not only his own perspective, but also the perspectives of those who crossed his path. Dressed in ragged clothes, his usually well-groomed appearance buried beneath an unkempt beard and layers of dirt, Keanu took to the streets of Los Angeles. He wanted to experience firsthand what it was like to be invisible, to be treated as less simply because of appearance. His goal? To step into the shoes of those society often ignored. His journey led him to a bustling McDonald's in the heart of the city, a place where people came and went in a blur of transactions, their eyes glued to their phones, their minds occupied with their own worlds. The bright interior, the rhythmic beeping of the fryers, and the distant chatter of customers formed a familiar yet impersonal backdrop. As Keanu pushed open the glass door, a few heads turned briefly, their gazes flickering over him before dismissing him entirely. His disheveled appearance set him apart from the usual clientele, but no one paid enough attention to recognize him beneath the disguise. He moved cautiously, scanning the room, observing the way people interacted. A young couple in the corner laughed over their meals. A businessman in a sharp suit tapped impatiently on his phone, waiting for his order. A group of teenagers joked loudly, their laughter cutting through the steady hum of conversation. Keanu approached the counter. The young cashier, a girl with a name tag that read Clara, glanced at him and hesitated. Her customer service smile faltered for a second before she forced it back into place. "Good evening, sir. What can I get for you?" she asked, her tone polite but cautious. Keanu reached into his pocket and placed a few coins on the counter. "Just a hamburger, please." Clara glanced down at the coins, her expression shifting. It wasn't enough. Not even close. She hesitated, torn between following the rules and acknowledging the quiet desperation in the man's tired eyes. Before she could respond, another voice cut through the moment. "What's going on here?" A tall man in a crisp button-up shirt stepped forward. His name tag read Coleman, and the rigid set of his jaw suggested he was the manager. His gaze landed on Keanu, his expression immediately turning to one of distaste. "He doesn't have enough money," Clara explained hesitantly. Coleman's eyes flicked toward the coins, then back at Keanu. "Then he can't eat here." His tone was final, dismissive, as if the conversation itself was a waste of his time. Keanu met his gaze, but said nothing. He had expected this reaction, but experiencing it firsthand still stung. Clara's fingers hovered over the tray of food, waiting to be discarded mistaken orders that would be thrown away. One simple gesture could change everything. She reached for a wrapped hamburger, but before she could hand it over, Coleman's voice rang out again. "Clara, don't." She froze, her heart pounding. Coleman stepped closer, lowering his voice but making sure it was still loud enough for others to hear. "We're not a charity. If we start giving food away, where does it stop? Rules are rules for a reason." The room had fallen eerily quiet. Customers were watching now, some with discomfort, others with curiosity. Keanu studied Coleman for a long moment before speaking. "What if the rules are wrong?" Coleman let out a short, humorless laugh. "Spoken like someone who's never had to run a business. If we start bending rules for one person, everyone will expect special treatment. That's not how the world works." A few customers shifted in their seats. Clara, her hands still hovering over the food, swallowed hard. Keanu tilted his head slightly. "And you think the world works better when we let good food go to waste while people go hungry?" Coleman's jaw tightened. "This conversation is over. You need to leave." The words settled heavily in the air. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, Keanu nodded. Without another word, he turned and walked away from the counter. But as he did, something in Clara snapped. She grabbed the hamburger, stepped out from behind the counter, and extended it toward him. "Here," she said, her voice steady but defiant. Coleman's face turned red. "Clara!" The room seemed to hold its breath. Keanu looked at her, something unreadable in his eyes. And then, just as Coleman opened his mouth to deliver his next order, Keanu did something that would change everything. A hush fell over the restaurant as Keanu stood still, his gaze locked on Clara. The young cashier's hands trembled slightly, but her resolve didn't waver. She had made her choice. Coleman's face twisted in fury. He marched toward her, his polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor. What do you think you're doing, Clara? She swallowed hard, but her voice remained steady. Giving someone food that was about to be thrown away. That's not your decision to make, Coleman snapped. His eyes flicked toward the growing crowd of onlookers. You're setting a dangerous precedent. Keanu studied him for a moment before responding. A dangerous precedent? You mean the idea that kindness should come before profit? A few customers murmured in agreement. The atmosphere in the restaurant had shifted. What had begun as an ordinary evening had become something much bigger. Coleman's lips pressed into a thin line. This conversation is over, Clara. Step back behind the counter. And as for you, he turned to Keanu, if you don't leave right now, I'll have security escort you out. Keanu sighed, shaking his head slightly. He had seen this kind of power play before, people so consumed by authority that they forgot the human element. But he wasn't here to argue. He was here to learn. With a quiet nod, he took the burger from Clara's hand, offering her a small, grateful smile. Thank you, he said softly. But before he could take a bite, Coleman snatched the burger from his hands. The entire restaurant gasped. Unbelievable, Coleman muttered. You think you can just break the rules and get away with it? He threw the burger into the trash. A heavy silence settled over the room. Clara's eyes widened, her hands clenching into fists. A mother sitting with her 2 kids shook her head in disbelief. A teenager in a hoodie muttered, "That was messed up, man." Keanu exhaled slowly. He had anticipated rejection, but this level of hostility surprised even him. "That was unnecessary," he said calmly. Coleman sneered. "What's unnecessary is people thinking they're entitled to something for free." He looked at Clara, his tone sharp. "You're done here. Go to the back and wait for me." Clara opened her mouth to protest, but before she could say a word, Keanu took a step forward. "I think you might regret that," he said, his voice still calm but carrying an unmistakable weight. Coleman laughed. "Oh yeah? And why's that?" Keanu didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached up and pulled off his scruffy fake beard. Then, he ran a hand through his disheveled hair, smoothing it back. Gasps rippled through the restaurant. The tired, homeless man standing before them wasn't just anyone. It was Keanu Reeves. The realization hit like a shockwave. Customers whispered to one another. A woman dropped her fries. A teenager pulled out his phone, recording the moment in stunned silence. Coleman's face went pale. "No way," he muttered. "This is some kind of joke." Keanu tilted his head. "I assure you it's not." The room buzzed with murmurs. People had ignored him before, but now they couldn't look away. Clara's breath hitched. "Oh my God," she whispered. 2 had no idea. Keanu turned to her with a small smile. "That's what makes your kindness even more incredible." Coleman, however, wasn't ready to back down. He forced a chuckle, though it sounded hollow. "Okay, very funny. You fooled us. But what's your point?" Keanu's smile faded. "My point?" He glanced around the restaurant, then met Coleman's eyes. "My point is that you treated me as if I was beneath you because you assumed I was homeless. You dismissed me, humiliated me, and threw away food just to prove a point. But now that you know who I am, you suddenly care?" Coleman's mouth opened, then shut again. He had no words. Keanu turned to the customers. "Let me ask you something," he said, his voice steady. "Would any of you have stood up for me if I really was homeless, or would you have just watched?" A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some averted their eyes. Others nodded, acknowledging the truth of his words. "This isn't about me," Keanu continued. "It's about how we see others. It's about what we choose to ignore." Clara wiped at her eyes, her emotions overwhelming her. Keanu turned back to Coleman. "You had the chance to show compassion tonight. You chose not to. And that says more about you than any rule book ever could." The restaurant fell silent. And then, something unexpected happened. A man in a business suit, who had been quietly watching from the corner, stood up. He walked to the counter, took out his wallet, and placed a crisp $100 bill down. "For the next person who needs a meal," he said simply. Then, another customer stood up and did the same. And another. Within minutes, a small pile of bills formed on the counter. Coleman stared at it, speechless. Keanu watched, his expression unreadable. Then, he turned to Clara. "You did something brave tonight," he said. "And I think bravery should be rewarded." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. Clara frowned, confused. "What is this?" "Open it." With shaky hands, she tore the envelope open. Her eyes widened as she saw the check inside. $50,000. She covered her mouth, her breath catching in her throat. "I can't accept this," she stammered. Keanu smiled. "You can. And you should. Because the world needs more people like you." Tears welled up in her eyes. She had spent so long feeling small, feeling like what she did didn't matter. But tonight, she had made a difference. And as Keanu turned to leave, the entire restaurant, every single person stood up and applauded. The applause echoed through the restaurant, filling the space with an energy unlike anything Clara had ever experienced. She clutched the check in her trembling hands, barely able to process what had just happened. Just minutes ago, she had been on the verge of losing her job. Now, Keanu Reeves himself had recognized her kindness and changed her life forever. Coleman, however, was still frozen in place, his face a storm of emotions. His authority, his confidence, had crumbled in the span of just a few minutes. The customers he had once ignored now stared at him with quiet judgment, their faces reflecting disappointment, even disdain. Keanu turned back to him, his gaze unreadable. "You still have a choice, Coleman," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You can stick to your rules and pretend tonight never happened. Or you can change." Coleman swallowed hard, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had spent years enforcing policies without question, believing that structure and discipline were the keys to success. But now, faced with the overwhelming reality of his actions, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: shame. He looked around the restaurant, at the growing pile of money left by customers who had been inspired by Keanu's words. He saw Clara, still holding the check, her eyes filled with gratitude and disbelief. And then he saw the other employees' workers who had always followed his orders without question, now looking at him as if seeing him for the first time. Slowly, he exhaled. "You're right," he admitted, his voice quieter than before. "I let my pride, my position, blind me to what really matters." Keanu nodded, as if he had expected this realization to come. "Then do something about it." For the first time that night, Coleman hesitated, not out of anger, but out of uncertainty. He had spent so long seeing the world in rigid terms, in black and white, in profit and loss. But now, the gray areas, the human side of things, had been laid bare in front of him. Finally, he took a step forward. Then another. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out his own wallet. Without a word, he took out several bills and placed them on the counter, adding them to the growing collection of donations. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Clara's lips parted in shock. Even Keanu seemed mildly surprised, though he hid it well. Coleman straightened his posture, then turned to Clara. His expression was no longer cold, and condescending, it was remorseful. "I was wrong," he admitted. "And if you're still willing to work here, I'd like to make things right." Clara blinked rapidly, unsure of what to say. She had never imagined Coleman admitting fault, much less offering an apology in front of an entire restaurant. "I don't want to just change rules on paper," he continued. "I want to change the way we do things. If you're willing, I'd like your help in making this place better." For a long moment, Clara said nothing. She simply studied him, searching for any sign that this was another act of control. But for the first time since she had met him, she saw something genuine in his eyes. Hope. She exhaled shakily, then gave a small nod. "Okay." A small smile tugged at the corner of Coleman's lips. Keanu watched the exchange, satisfaction flickering in his expression. He had come here to observe, to learn about human nature, but in the end, he had done something much bigger. He had sparked change. The restaurant, once just another fast food chain in the middle of a busy city, had become something else tonight. A reminder that kindness, no matter how small, had the power to transform. Keanu took a step back, glancing around one last time. The restaurant was alive with hushed conversations, with people exchanging thoughts and stories, some leaving even more money on the counter for those in need. His job here was done. Turning to Clara one final time, he offered her a warm smile. "Keep being you, Clara. The world needs more of that." She let out a breathless laugh, still in disbelief. "Thank you. For everything." Keanu nodded. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the door. The moment his hand touched the handle, a voice called out, "Mr. Reeves?" He turned slightly, finding a young girl no older than 10 standing near a booth with her mother. She looked nervous, as if she hadn't meant to say his name out loud, but now that she had, she couldn't back down. Keanu gave her a gentle smile. "Yeah?" The girl hesitated, then finally asked, "Why did you do all of this?" The restaurant went silent once more. Everyone, including Coleman and Clara, waited for his answer. Keanu thought for a moment, then said simply, "Because everyone deserves kindness." With that, he pushed open the door and stepped out into the night, disappearing into the city as quietly as he had arrived. Inside the restaurant, the customers remained still, absorbing the weight of his words. The moment lingered, stretching through the air, until finally a single clap broke the silence. Then another, and another, until the entire restaurant was applauding not just for Keanu, but for what he had reminded them all, that in a world often too busy to care, kindness still mattered. And it always would. The door closed behind Keanu, but his words lingered in the air. Inside the McDonald's, something had shifted. People weren't just going back to their meals, they were reflecting on what they had just witnessed. Clara looked down at the check in her hands, still struggling to believe it was real. It wasn't just about the money, it was about what it represented. A chance, a turning point, a reminder that even small acts of kindness could make a difference. Coleman exhaled heavily, his gaze shifting from Clara to the pile of money left by customers. For the first time in a long while, he looked unsure. The authority he had always carried with ease now felt shaken. "All right," he said finally, rubbing the back of his neck. His voice was quieter, almost hesitant. We need to do something with this money." Clara looked up at him, surprised. "Maybe we could start a fund," she suggested. "Something to help people in need." Coleman studied her for a moment. Just hours ago, he would have dismissed such an idea outright, but tonight had changed things. He had changed. After a long pause, he nodded. That actually might be a good idea. A few customers, who had lingered to watch the aftermath of the evening's events, perked up at his words. One man, still standing near the counter, spoke up. "You know, if you do that, I'd be happy to donate more." Others murmured in agreement. The energy in the restaurant had transformed. What had started as a simple act of defiance had sparked something much bigger. Clara felt her heart race. Could this really be happening? Could a single night truly change everything? She turned back to Coleman, expecting to see resistance in his eyes. But instead, she saw something else: possibility. "Then let's do it," he said. The words were simple, but they carried weight. This was just the beginning. The next morning, the McDonald's was buzzing not just with the usual breakfast rush, but with something new, something different. Word of the previous night's events had spread like wildfire. Customers who hadn't been there were now showing up, curious about the story. Some came just to see if it was really true, while others arrived with an unexpected purpose to contribute. By noon, the pile of money on the counter had doubled, then tripled. Clara stood behind the register, still adjusting to this surreal turn of events. She had always thought of her job as just that, a job. But now, it felt like something bigger. Coleman, standing nearby, had changed too. He wasn't barking orders or enforcing rules with an iron fist. Instead, he was really listening to customers and employees alike. He had already made an official call to corporate, asking about starting a donation initiative through the restaurant. And then, just when Clara thought the day couldn't get any stranger, the door swung open, and in walked a familiar face: Keanu Reeves. The restaurant fell into an immediate hush. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Even the sound of the fryers seemed to fade into the background. Clara's heart pounded as Keanu gave her a warm smile and walked right up to the counter. "How's everything going?" he asked, his voice casual, as if he were just another customer. Clara let out a breathless laugh. "Better than I ever could have imagined." Keanu glanced at the growing pile of money. "Looks like a lot of people believe in what you're doing." She nodded. "And it's all because of what you started last night." Keanu shook his head. "No," he said gently. "It's because of you, and all the people who chose to care." Behind him, a news crew had entered the restaurant, cameras rolling. The story had reached the media, and now the entire city was watching. But Clara wasn't thinking about the cameras, the headlines, or even the money piling up on the counter. She was thinking about how one small atone moment of kindness had led to all of this. And as she met Keanu's knowing gaze, she realized something. This wasn't just a single night's event. This was the beginning of a movement,